Could I please ask each of the panel, in terms of public service reform, what is the first reform they would make and on what timescale? And what would be the last reform, or the one they considered least important? How they would capacity build in communities. We had a reference this morning from Leslie Riddoch about the difficulties of capacity and succession in some community councils, with reference to a need for some radical rockers. And on the question of the majority in the Parliament, the issue alleged, and I use that word alleged very advisedly, in the papers that the presiding officer wasn't giving sufficient time to opposition questions and comment. Has that situation improved?
Oh, sneaked in two questions. We'll go with the first question first, the public service reform. Which reform? If you were John Swinney and in charge of these things, what would be the first change which you would make to the public service landscape? Alison?
Well, I think that's a very big question. Thank you, Anne. I suppose I'm very, very concerned about the health of our Scottish nation, and I really do think we should address that as a matter of urgency. Our spend on that is absolutely vast. One of your speakers in the, I think it was Peter McCall, was speaking about preventative spend. And I think if we looked at all of our policies and understood fully the impact they were going to have on national health, we could probably cut that bill down massively. And that goes, when we're looking at road building projects, when we're looking at where we're siting our schools, when we're looking at development, if we were always understanding the impact that would have on people's physical and mental health, I think we could save ourselves a fortune and become that sort of fitter, healthier Scotland that we desperately need to become. Anne's other questions?
We'll stick with the first question, we'll come back to the second question. Marco, do you want to answer the question about public service reform? It's something...
The first thing and the last thing then, do
The first thing and the last thing.
I don't think you can say the first thing and the last thing. Perhaps you can say the most important thing. And that's a personal decision for everyone. It doesn't necessarily run down the other choices. And I would go with the preventative spend approach, but I would look more at education. That's my particular passion. That's the committee I'm on and the area I'm involved in. We have, Peter McCall mentioned before, multipliers of 3 or 4 for spending in older people. If you invest in early years support and building family relationships and helping overcome some of the financial barriers that parents have at the very start of life, you can have multipliers of 6 and 7. And I don't like talking about multipliers really, because it is more about the fact that people have one childhood, and we owe it as a country to make sure that as many people have the best possible start in life. That would be, for me, the first priority, personally.
Is there a reform which is being discussed in the air, maybe a part of a submission to Christie or whatever, which you vehemently disagree with, Marco?
That I disagree with?
Yeah.
Well, I think you can look at most of the programme of the UK coalition government for examples of public service reforms that I would disagree with. In principally in the NHS, I think jumps out at me.
Willie?
I think Marco needs to catch up with the changes that have come about within the NHS reforms. But I think some of the things we need to look at is the stuff that John Seddon has been looking at around public sector reform, about removing targets, about the guidance, top-down guidance and instructions from central government, putting innovators in place within public sector so we can get the change that's required from the bottom up rather than the top down. I think that's what I mean by public sector reform. I think I also agree with early intervention and all that bag of stuff. It's very important. But in terms of reform of the service, I think removing guidance, removing top-down targets and instructions is the way to go. And the last thing that I would do, in fact I would never do it, is centralise the police.
There you go. Peter?
Sorry, could I have a quick follow-up to that? I talked earlier about a specific duty...
The microphone, Peter.
Oh, sorry.
I know you don't really need one, but...
I'll now deafen you all. I talked earlier about a specific duty to prevent. I mean, I think prevention is a very knotty problem. It's something that we've been talking about for a long time. Everybody agrees with it, and it's something that's very easy to agree with. The question is how we deliver it. I'm interested in a duty to prevent, although I'm not set that that's necessarily the way to deliver this. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, or your thoughts on other ways that we can actually deliver prevention rather than saying that it's a good thing and saying that we all agree with it, because we do all agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to ask local communities, they want to have early intervention. They want to improve their life chances. It's not just central government that wants to do that. I think there can be a discussion on a national basis about outcomes and what we're trying to achieve, where we're trying to head towards. But to actually have the detailed instructions about how to do it, I don't think that's the role of central government, because I think innovators, consumers and local people and the producers of the service are best placed to shape the service for their community. So I agree with you in the major part of what you're in the ambition, but I think we need to be careful about how detailed we are from the centre.
Alison, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. We should feel, we are spending public money, so we should feel a duty to prevent negative outcomes. When we're closing nurseries and schools and so on in local communities, we must understand the roll-on, the effect this will have. Because it's all the so-called, Cinderella services like youth clubs and so on that are bearing the brunt of cuts at present, and these will have an impact. What are these young people going to do? I think when the council was setting its budget last year, they went out and had several sort of consultation meetings. They were maybe a bit, they were a bit sort of rigged, in my opinion, with regards to the outcome. The questions weren't as flexible and as open as they might have been, but people were kind of, I think in the end, the overwhelming majority thought, yes, we should spend more on policing and so on, but there was a willingness to cut all of the steps that might have prevented more police being needed in the first place, and I think we have to change that around. And I do think that local communities would vote entirely differently to a centralised system.
Okay, there were other people wanting in on this question. Peter, was it? No? Anybody wanting in on this question? Just before I ask Marco. Gordon.
So Gordon McRae from Shelter Scotland. One area where we have seen duties imposed and at the same time the removal of ring fencing has actually been homelessness services over the last few years, and they have got worse over the last 5 years. There hasn't been an A-rated homelessness service since Edinburgh about 5 years ago, and at the same time we've seen other housing services improve because that's where the local community want to see things happen. So I understand the desire for more flexibility, more empowerment, but there does need to be a retention of that protection of, first of all, rights, but also ensuring that resources get to the people in most vulnerable and most at risk, and especially children, we've seen the family services decimated in the back of the removal of supporting people.
Marco.
Yes, it's another example where localism perhaps isn't quite working in the implementation. And yes, we have to, as representatives, show leadership and make sure that we can present options that might well be considered courageous to explain that there are causes that are not going to be popular but are going to be necessary. And that goes through all levels. Localism has meant that localism as it currently functions means that councils do have to take the decisions about local nurseries, local schools, many local issues that are impacting on people's perceptions of where we're going in the public sector. These are local decisions that are being taken, and we don't automatically look at it and think, well, that's localism, that's fine, because there are the problems with leadership and the problems with easy answers that Alison was identifying. And to go back very far to Peter's point, the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee has recommended that every committee now examines the budget in the context of preventative spend. That's not a big step, really, but it may start to move a culture in Parliament. It would, I have to say, be a lot easier to implement preventative spend as our income was going up considerably, because then we wouldn't have to be taking money from Peter to pay Paul.
Okay, Anne, could you re-ask your second question just to refresh everybody's memory, including mine?
Well, it was partly the issue of what they thought would be, as it were, the least important reform, but I accept your point about them all being important. Capacity building in terms of the skills of community councils and other community groups, and the building maybe of a skills bank other than Time Bank or something, and the willingness of people to lend their knowledge not only in their immediate patch, but maybe the patch next door, as it were. And then the question of, and I use again very, very wisely the word alleged, issue of opposition having enough time in both questions and debate.
Okay, I think there's a couple of issues in here. Willie, just on that localism question, how do we turn fine words and policies of devolving responsibility down to local level, or dare I say, in the absence of a Conservative rep, turn the big society into real action on the ground? How do we go about empowering and enabling local people to do those tasks?
I think there's two parts of it. There is the removal of the top-down instruction, I think, is part of it. But the second one is putting innovators in place, people who agitate for change. And the third thing is allowing a bit of chaos. Allowing, organisations, communities of interest to develop. It doesn't have to be all within the silos of community councils. It could be any kind of group, any kind of, it doesn't have to be even at a local level. It can be across large geographical areas with communities of interest. Allowing that to happen, and don't fret when there's a postcode lottery. If people decide at a local level they prioritise that rather than that, then that's their choice. It's their decision to take. So I think a wee bit of chaos does no harm, actually.
Well, aren't silos the death of innovation?
Yeah, I agree.
Anybody, Mark or Alison, want to pick up on the postcode lottery question? I mean, it has been a real constraint on public policy debate. How do you balance local diversity on the one hand and the need to localise as much as you can? And we've had that throughout the whole of today in terms of the discussion, and not get into being accused of postcode prescription and all that, two-tier service, all that kind of thing. How do you get that balance right?
You have to have a big debate. I don't think we've got there yet. I think what Willie said is right. When you do have processes that are supported, that are transparent and that are respected, and they follow to a conclusion that leads to different levels of provision in different parts of a country, then you are at a legitimate standpoint. The problem is more where people lose faith in the process, where they think decisions are being taken by people that aren't representative, that they haven't been involved. That is where you start to get resentment with people in, for example, one NHS board not being able to access treatment that they could access in another. It is supposed to be a national health service, and people, I think, are seeing a disjoint there between what they expect and how they think these decisions should be made and how they are being made. And I think it's something that's going to have to be addressed in the next 5 years.
But Marco, do you not think that it's people not getting a service they think they need, rather than being envious of somebody else having that service, that's the point? Because I think people decide in the local level if they want a certain service to be prioritised. And if that's the community decision, that's the community decision, irrespective of whatever any other community wants. In that respect, it's a series of local health services that I would favour. Now, sometimes you need to step in and you say they've mismanaged it, but that's a different question. But I think we should allow diversity and colour because that meets local needs.